Now, schools reopen, more learners tomorrow will be going back to school. Early childhood development centers might not be able to receive pupils as more than 175,000 long-term ECD teachers and support staff face the risk of losing their jobs if there is no urgent financial aid. Now, for more on this, I'm joined by the director of the Center for Early Childhood Development, Professor Eric Atmore. Prof, good evening and thank you for your time tonight. We saw last week from the 17th of August to the 21st of August, teachers in the early childhood development sector embarking on a national strike. This after reaching out to the Minister of Social Development around the redirecting of the 1.3 billion rands towards the employment of all those I've just mentioned, 175,000 workforce of ECDs. Have you got audience with the Minister? Has she responded to your request?
Tabo, good evening, and good evening to your viewers. I just want to correct you. Tonight I'm representing the Civil Society Coalition for Early Childhood Development, not the Center for Early Childhood Development, although I speak for them as well. The week was full of protest in every corner of the country. In 4 decades, have not seen such mobilization. Certainly not since the 1980s, and it culminated in a protest outside Parliament on Friday. The response from the Minister and from the department has been very, very disappointing. On Thursday, they released a media statement which talks about they're still busy working on the practicalities, but it gives no shift in the thinking away from employing compliance officers, when the big need at the moment is to get those 175,000 teachers back into ECD centers with a reasonable stipend so that children can benefit. Yeah. The response has been, up to this point, it's been very, very disappointing.
So do you feel like the ECD community is left out in the education discourse? As we are talking about the reopening of schools, there seems to be no attention that is given to the reopening of ECD centers. Are you saying the country is simply paying lip service to the importance of early childhood education?
Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. Remember, the government did not open or did not allow ECD centers to be opened. That had to be instructed by the Gauteng High Court on the 6th of July. If anything, the National Department of Social Development resisted opening ECD centers all the way through level 3. And it was only a very brave court action that forced ECD centers or allowed ECD centers to open. I think, we've got a really good constitution which talks about in the best interest of the child. We've got a very good national ECD policy which talks about the best interest of the child. But the fact of the matter is that the political will to drive early childhood development is wholly absent. And we're seeing it in this situation where it is so obvious that ECD workers need a stimulus package in order to enable them to get back to work. But what government wants to do is they want to use that money for compliance. And that's what the protest was about.
So, but when you mention political will, of course, that automatically means political principle to me, to say the political principle who is, of course, holding that political office doesn't have the will to recognize ECDs as essential in our education.
Yes, that's both the political principle, being the minister in this case, but also her senior officials. The early childhood sector has put forward numerous proposals. We've submitted 2 petitions, one with 6,500 signatures and the other with more than 10,000 signatures. And the proposals we're making are very simple. Ensure that every ECD worker in a vulnerable community, whether the ECD center is registered or not, that they get a package which covers their part of their salary for at least 6 months, but preferably for a year at a reasonable amount. That will enable these teachers to open their ECD centers. and it will enable more than 2.5 million young children to get the early learning that they need, to get the healthy, nutritious meal that they need, and to be safe. At the moment, those children are languishing in communities. They're not getting the early stimulation. They're not getting the nutritious meal, and they've been placed in highly dangerous situations. And we've had now close on 4 known cases of preschool age children who've been murdered, the youngest as young as 2 years old in the Western Cape. So what's coming through very strongly is an uncaring social development department, and we really are disappointed at this irrational obsession with compliance, and compliance.
So, I mean,
now,
in simple terms, 1.3 billion towards the employment of 36,000 young compliance monitors, you're saying, is an illogical allocation. That 1.3 billion, how would it serve your 30,000 or so centers which were closed for a large part of the year?
We are not saying that compliance is not important, but there's a time for compliance. And now, at level 3, after 5 months, it's the time to get the centers up and running. The compliance come later. We are saying take that 1.3 billion, use it to fund the part of the salaries of 175,000 women who work with those young children. That will enable those centers to start to get up and running. See, in 6 months' time, once the situation is normalized, the compliance element can be brought in, because compliance is very important. So we are not saying compliance and meeting the registration requirements must not be focused on. We're just saying it's too early. It's like treating somebody who's had a heart attack by putting a piece of plaster on their big toe. There's no rationality in that.
Is it true, though, Prof, that a large number of ECD centers are not registered with the department and therefore do not qualify for funding?
That is a fact. About 50% of our 32,000 ECD centers are not registered. Now, there's a difference between being not registered and not wanting to register. The history of colonialism, the history of apartheid, and the poverty and inequality in this country prevents those unregistered centers from registering. For example, to register, you need to meet certain compliance standards, and often that can cost you 50 or 60,000 rand. Now, an ECD center in a vulnerable community, wooden iron structures, cannot even afford to pay reasonable salaries, let alone the 40 to 50,000 rand for architectural plans, for land rezoning, and sometimes for parking bays. I think the whole idea of the minimum requirements for compliance needs to be looked at, and some sort of stimulus package to enable centers to register.
But those minimum requirements, Prof, are there also for the safety of the children, are they not? To ensure that the buildings are properly compliant, so that the kids are safe, that security is in place and it is visible, because, of course, kids are vulnerable and there are those unwholesome elements, in fact, barbaric elements that prey on our children.
Yes. Look, the compliance requirements are not bad. They're certainly much better than they were during the apartheid years. The thing is that they are unaffordable. You know, if you're in the leafy suburbs of the Western Cape or of Gauteng, you can afford to pay for rezoning and you can afford to pay for many of the compliance requirements. But if you're in a poor area where there's huge rates of unemployment and where salaries and wages are low, it is very difficult. So I want to stress, I'm not aware of a single ECD center that would not like to register. They are just certainly not able to afford it. So there's a whole stimulus package there, because essentially these ECD centers are small businesses. They provide employment at no cost to government for 175,000 people, predominantly women. So it's a growing industry, and government has to come to the party
Right.
to enable it to function.